I'm honored to welcome Dr. Subramanian Swamy, a highly respected economist, Harvard professor, and senior leader of the BJP party, including the chairman of its strategy committee. Dr. Subramanian Swamy has been a political leader of India for decades. He was elected 5 times as a member of parliament, 3 times for the Lok Sabha, which for non-Indians is the lower house of India's bicameral parliament, and 2 times for the Rajya Sabha, the higher house of the parliament. He also served as the Union Cabinet Minister for Commerce, Law and Justice. One of Dr. Subramanian Swamy's outstanding achievements was to organize with the Chinese government, with Chairman Deng Xiaoping, to open the Mount Kailash, Mount Mansarovar pilgrim route for Hindu pilgrims. He himself was in the first group to use the newly opened route. Also, Dr. Swamy, through the Supreme Court of India, prevented the destruction of Ram Setu, the bridge that Ram built to cross from India to Sri Lanka. He has led in advocating in India the disbanding of the Soviet Union-based socialist economic policies and implementing market-based, liberalized economic reforms. We warmly welcome you, Dr. Swamy.
I'm going to speak to you about the relevance of Veda in modern economic policies. And therefore, I especially thank the Foundation for Vedic India and the Maharishi Veda Vyasa Pratishthan for this invitation to speak to such a distinguished audience. First of all, I'd like to give my salutation to Pujya Jagadguru Sankaracharya and all the important religious leaders from the Hindu faith today here. Also, the delegates who have come from different parts of the country and their association with these 2 great organizations which have done tremendous work in spreading the concept and the spirituality of India all over the world. I spoke on this subject, first of all, in a Catholic university called Fordham University in New York, when there was a conference called by one of the professors there, who was an Indian, called Rishikesh Vinod. And subsequently, he was able to get the book published, Hindu Economics, where one of the chapters is on mine. I also wrote a book recently, which our great respected leader, Sri Ashok Singhal of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, released along with the head of the RSS, Sri Mohan Bhagwat, called Hindutva and National Renaissance in India, in which a chapter devotes to Hindutva and economics. First of all, I'd like to begin by saying that there is no such thing as Hindu economics or Vedic economics. Economic laws are scientific, and there are Vedic principles or Hindutva principles which, when applied, will give you a different result from what the current traditional economic theories teach you. That's because ultimately economic policy making is in 4 dimensions. Dimension 1 is the objectives you choose. In the Western world market economy, profit maximization is the fundamental driving principle. or for the consumer, what they call as the utility or satisfaction maximization. And in the Soviet world, the communist world, it's usually maximization of production. So the question would be for us as a Vedic society, what is the objective we choose? And once we choose the objectives, then you have to decide on your priorities. And having chosen your priorities, you have to select your strategy for achieving those priorities and objectives. And finally, you have to explain how you will, differently from the West, mobilize resources for financing such an economic policy. So this is the way in which we distinguish ourselves from the rest of the world, by having different objectives, different priorities, a different strategy, and different methods of extracting funds for the purpose of financing these projects. Now, there are a number of priorities which we have, but first of all, the most important objective for us is to be able to serve the largest numbers of people in a Vedic society, to create what is called as the best scenario for happiness. How is the happiness achieved? We don't believe in the Vedic system that pure materialistic one-dimensional approach will produce happiness. It has to be harmonized with spiritual advancement. So the two of them together is what we call, in a sense, Sanatana Dharma, where we don't look down upon material prosperity. We in fact want material prosperity. But it should be balanced with spiritual values. The original concept of the Varna system was based on this methodology. The Varna system was based on the principle that the pursuit of knowledge and sacrifice were the highest values. And that is why the Acharyas, or what came to be later known as Brahmins, were placed at the top of the pyramid of the society. I remember when I first went as a student to Harvard, my classmate was an American, asked me that I'm not able to understand how you Indians followed Mahatma Gandhi. So I asked him why he's asking me this question, what is wrong with it. He said the man is not properly dressed. So I said, if Mahatma Gandhi came to United States and wanted to lead here a movement, what would you do? He said, we'll have him arrested for indecent exposure. In a sense, when you think about it, our leaders always have been extraordinarily simply dressed. Our spiritual leaders also very, very simply dressed. He may be a Shankaracharya, but he will not wear anything more than a saffron cloth. Whereas in the West, you see your leaders are extremely well dressed. And if they don't take care to look proper, they may even lose an election. There's a story that I read in Theodore White's book on the American presidential elections of 1960 when Kennedy won. That one of the reasons he lost the debate with Kennedy was that he came without shaving and there was an afternoon shadow on his cheek. And therefore, Kennedy looked much handsomer and much better dressed. In India, this doesn't count at all. Mahatma Gandhi was called all kinds of names by the British, including that he was a half-naked fakir. But the people adored him. Why? Because the sacrifice he represented. That he could have been a barrister earning crores of rupees, but instead he gave it all up and just wore a piece of loincloth and moved around the country. So the division we created essentially was a division of labor. that those who pursue knowledge will not have any weapons, will not have any land, will not have any property, will not have any wealth. In fact, it took it to the ultimate that they should meet their daily needs by begging. And it was not considered infra-dig to beg, because those who gave actually earned punya, as it was called, by giving to them. And those who did have weapons, they were kings, but they were not kings like monarchs of Europe. They were people who could not make policy. For policy, they had to go to the acharyas and the brahmins. And they had to go to his hut and pay obeisance to him and then ask whether he could do certain things. He could not dispense justice. In Europe, the kings could do all. Could declare war, could declare policy, could declare and give punishments for those who committed breach of the law. But not in the Indian system. Those who made wealth were third in the rank. That is, the Indian society the Hindu society or the Vedic society was never structured on wealth. Whereas the Western society is structured on how much wealth you have. Because it's a feeling that holding wealth as the ultimate value would lead to greed, and greed would lead to corruption. And therefore, anyone who makes wealth and then donates whatever is excess to what he needs would enjoy a status in society. And those who till the land were those who had to produce for the society, for eating, for milk, etc. So this was the division. And even those special category created what later came to be known as scheduled castes were not birth dependent. None of these four divisions were birth dependent. If it was so, then how is it that Veda Vyasa, whose mother was a fisherwoman, became a Maharishi and wrote the Mahabharata? Or Kalidasa, who used to cut branches of trees in the forest, became the greatest poet we produced and became a Maharishi. Vishwamitra, who was known as Rishi of Rishis, was born in a Kshatriya family. And the Dalits own Valmiki and say that he was one of us, but he became a Maharishi and wrote the Ramayana. And nor was the Acharya or the Brahmin, if he broke any law, was above the law. Ravan was a Brahmin. Most people don't know that Ravan was a Brahmin. The British created a whole movement called the Dravidian movement. And Mr. Karunanidhi used to celebrate Ravan Leela while we were celebrating Ram Leela, on the grounds that Ravan was a South Indian king from Sri Lanka. Actually, Ravan was not born in South India. He was born near Delhi in a place called Noida, in a village called Basarak. You can still go and see that village. He went to Mansarovar and he did tapas, and Lord Shiva gave him a boon, which he used to then he surveyed which part of the Indian subcontinent he could conquer, and he found that his relative Guber had developed Sri Lanka, and that's how he went to Sri Lanka. And his wife Mandodari was born in Meerut. So, but the British had concocted a history for us, which included that Ravan was a Dravidian king. And for years, the South Indian movement of Dravidian parties celebrated Ravan Leela, but ultimately I can claim that I persuaded Mr. Karunanidhi to read the Tamil version of Ramayana, the Kamban Ramayana, and come to the conclusion that Ravan was indeed a North Indian. After that, he lost interest in him. But Karunanidhi, however, never forgot that Rama was from North India. And he opposed him tooth and nail. And when I was arguing the Supreme Court that Rama Setu should be protected. He got so agitated that in public he said, who's Swami to call it Ram Setu? It is actually Adam's bridge. Did Ram build it? Does he have an engineering degree? Which engineering college he went to? Well, the following day he fell sick and he had to be admitted to hospital. And the name of the hospital was Ramchandra Medical Hospital. So I sent him a get well card and said, I hope he's got MBBS or an MD. Ramachandra ji has that. These are some of the false impressions that have been created about our Vedic past, which have to be removed. We are not a society of spiritual mendicants. We are a society which produced the maximum wealth for almost thousands of years. And till 1750, before the Industrial Revolution brought in locomotives and Bessemer blast furnace, we were considered amongst the most developed country. We were ahead of China till 1100 AD. And then the decline started and China overtook us. But in the end, both were developed countries in the 1750s. It's only towards the 20th century that we became poor countries. Therefore, this system had produced this miracle. And the first principle would be division of labor according to the Varna system, which today we cannot replicate because it has got so embedded with birth that it's unrescuable in my opinion. And at least we need some period when we all forget our Varnas and treat ourselves as a Vedic society or a Hindu society and nothing more than that, and forget about our so-called Varna label. So one of the priorities we give, some of the priorities we give are, we have always been a society which has emphasized self-reliance, which we call Swadeshi. Then Swadeshi was a concept which could go down to the village. So Swadeshi was always coupled with decentralization. And we wanted all our Janapadas, as Chanakya had called our society divisions, as self-sustaining, self-governing, self-contented, self-producing units. So this decentralization and producing out of your own resources. That didn't mean we didn't trade. We did trade. We traded with the whole of Southeast Asia. The Hindu stamp is quite obvious. The third priority we place is what I would broadly call as dharma, as applied to economics. Now, if I am a capitalist and I build a factory and pump a lot of smoke into the air without any safeguards on environment, I am maximizing my profit, but I am ruining the society. I am creating ill health in society. So this concept of private cost and private revenue, and therefore private profit as a deduction of cost from revenue, is a capitalist concept, but it is not part of our Vedic way of thinking. Our Vedic way of thinking is much more in keeping with what today Western economists use the terminology of social cost and social revenue. And that social revenue minus social cost is what needs to be maximized. Social cost takes into account what benefits accrues to society. Supposing in a dark street I put lamps, electric lamps. That electric lamp enables the whole society. It can't be consumed. There's no such thing as consuming light, except, of course, the bulb may be fused or the electricity may run out. But otherwise, this is a thing that the more you use that light, it doesn't mean that you have less for somebody else. So it's a social good in that sense. Or I start an orchard, put it very simple example, an orchard, and that orchard, when it flowers, the bees come and sit on it, and then later on produce honey. So if there's a person next door who starts a honey producing beehive setup, he will free of cost be able to produce the honey which he can sell. The benefit of organizing that way is something which is essentially you will find in our Vedic system. And this is what I call as dharma, where you consider the overall social impact of your private pursuit of economics. And therefore this social consciousness is very, very deeply built into the Vedic system. And finally, we have something called sanmati, that means create consensus. If today in a market system, we go by majority decisions, then it is possible for a society by majority to prefer, say, coffee and prefer coffee to tea and tea to chocolate or hot chocolate. And yet by the same majority calculation, you can find that chocolate will be preferred to coffee. That is, the choices become what is called as intransitive. Logically, if I prefer A to B and B to C, then I must prefer A to C. But in a democratic framework, where everybody has a freedom to do what he wants, the laissez-faire principle, then you can show situations, which I've shown in my writings, that by majority selection, the market selection, so to speak, A can be preferred to B and B can be preferred to C, and at the same time C can be preferred to A. That is called inconsistency. And that is something we abhor in our Vedic society, and that's why we talk about consensus. Consensus produces logical choices, it produces consistency. So these are some of the priorities that we have in a Vedic system. Now, in terms of strategy, the Western society and the communist society have been divided on purely economic terms. The communists call it haves and have-nots. And they say that all the history is economics and it is class struggle. And therefore class struggle is the fundamental principle of communism. When people say, no, concern for poverty is communism, no, that concern everybody has. The difference between communist ideology and any other ideology is the commitment to class struggle coupled with class annihilation. That is, the have-nots must annihilate the haves. That's the fundamental principle of communism. And the haves are those who have money, who have wealth, and the have-nots who have nothing but their labor. That's the Marxian principle. Now, how do you apply that in India? Because, strictly speaking, the acharyas of our country are also have-nots. They don't have any wealth. In our society, Brahmins are generally poor, but they are highly respected. How do you create a class struggle between a Brahmin and a Shudra? Because it's not haves and have-nots. The Shudra is the have. The Brahmin has nothing except knowledge. It's not material. So the class struggle doesn't apply to Hindu society or the Vedic society. Because how do you define classes in India? So you can only speak in terms of creating animosity between the Varnas, but that is a concept alien to Vedic society. There was never, the harmony was the fundamental principle. That's why I talk about consensus. It is the later principle, later development, when the Brahmins began advocating freedom from the British, the Brahmins were in the forefront of preparing soldiers and fighters against Islamic invasion, that they became the target. And they became the easy target because they had nothing. So the class struggle doesn't apply to Vedic society in its original form. So what is the fundamental principle by which the Hindu society or the Vedic society operates? The closest Western concept I've seen is something we call as Pareto optimality, where we seek changes where no one is worse off and some are better off. That is a concept of Pareto optimality, which is how the Vedic society is structured. So therefore, we have traditionally created the concept of trusteeship, which Mahatma Gandhi advocated very strongly. We have put it in terms of how the society creates a consensus in the distribution of all power and making of decisions. And it is this fundamental principle, this is the strategy which Vedic society has. It works through consensus, and it is this fundamental principle, this is the strategy which Vedic society has. It works through consensus, and it seeks to see that the growth or the change is such that no one is worse off, even if some become better off. And that requires a non-conflict society, because jealousy is a factor which can drive any society to extremes. I was very surprised when the Communist Party of China 2 years ago adopted a resolution that China needs now a harmonious society. And the then president of China, Hu Jintao, while addressing the Communist Party general body, said that our economic reform has created a wide gulf between urban areas and rural areas. And this has led to jealousies and therefore potential for conflict. And then he invoked the Buddhist principle, where he said ownership of wealth is not important, which is actually our Vedic concept translated in different terminology in Buddhism. And therefore, Communist Party formally adopted the harmonious society concept, and then after that they lifted the ban on Buddhist conferences, and today China, it has become fashionable to acknowledge that you are a Buddhist or a Confucianist, because Confucius also says more or less the same thing. There's a famous story of how Confucius came with very old clothes to a wedding of a noble person, and the guards turned him away. So he went back home and put on his finest clothes and came back, and the guard saluted him and led him inside. And when the time came to eat food, he started feeding his clothes into the food. And people said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, you didn't invite me, you invited my clothes, so therefore I'm feeding my clothes." That's what Confucius said. So therefore, there is this is the Buddhist, Hindu, all these are really essentially come from the core of Vedic society. And it is that which is extremely important. Now we come to the question that if you are going to make economic policies for accelerating the growth of India, what is the most important element that needs to be focused on? Gone are the days when economists thought that more capital and more labor produces economic growth. We now know it is not more capital, more labor, but it is newer innovations that make the difference. that changed the productivity of capital to a higher level and of labor to a higher level. So, industrial revolution would never have taken place had locomotives not been invented, and a Bessemer steel blast furnace had not been invented. Later on, other innovations came: the jet engine, the fax machines, and the latest one, which has led to complete revolution and therefore globalization of our globe, and that is the internet. These are innovations. As time passes, more and more innovations come. And it is this where I think the Vedic society is most equipped, because of the intellectual traditions that we incorporate into our society. And therefore, we have to go back into the Vedas, the Upanishads in particular, and even parts of the Gita, to understand what is intelligence. Because it is intelligence, the human intelligence, that produces the innovation. And that intelligence must not only produce the innovation, but it must also make him conscious of his duty to society, to see that he doesn't destroy society by his innovations. And today, out of the Vedic literature, United States, particularly Harvard University Department of Education, has constructed 7 different dimensions of intelligence. The first dimension, which today in India is all that we teach, is what we call as cognitive intelligence. Learning physics, mathematics, management science, etc. These are cognitive sciences. And they are studying of natural phenomenon, studying of logic, etc. But there are other dimensions of intelligence which are equally important for building of a stable, mature society. One of the second dimension of intelligence, which is now being propagated and taught, which we knew for a long time, is something called emotional intelligence. How to speak in a non-confrontationist language, to speak in such a way that you win over people to your point of view rather than antagonize them. And that quality has to be tempered with other dimensions of intelligence, otherwise it's a dangerous quality. Hitler had that quality. He spoke and people got convinced. And they got convinced of the wrong thing. So, emotional intelligence, the capacity to be able to present your point of view in such a manner that the person who is either new or is opposed to your idea suddenly finds the necessity to think about it and perhaps come over to us. When Adi Shankaracharya engaged in Shastratas around the country, where he argued with Buddhist scholars, Mimamsa school scholars, and converted them back to the original form of Hinduism, he did not employ any force. It was argumentation. How he argued, the methods of argument, they are all there in the Shankaracharya's writings. But that is a thing that has to be moderated by what we call as moral intelligence. Moral intelligence is when you do not use your intelligence in a way by which you harm somebody else, which I originally called as Pareto optimality. You do it to further your enterprise, but without causing harm. You don't set up a factory which pumps smoke into the air because you can make more profit and you don't have to spend on environmental control. So this is the third dimension of intelligence. The fourth dimension of intelligence is what is now being called is social intelligence. And social intelligence is to be able to engage in those activities which will create a better society. Then the fifth one, which is something which our sages have always been talking about, is spiritual intelligence. Based on the premise that all knowledge is in the cosmos, past, present, future, which in cosmos we call as the Brahmand. And your mind is capable of, provided it is disciplined, of linking into that Brahmand, by which you are able to discover all the innovations necessary for further growth. This is what the Americans call now as the neural Wi-Fi. That you connect to the Brahmand, the cosmos, and from that you get the inspiration for knowledge. And of course, in our system, you have to do these disciplines of meditations, yoga and so on, which prepares you for ultimately to be able to do that. There is then other dimensions of intelligence, environmental, respect for the environment, that you don't leave the world in a worse place than you found it, and innovational intelligence, where you search for new ways of doing the same things that you used to do before, or go into a totally new dimension. Nobody would have thought a thing like cell phone would ever be invented 50 years ago or 40 years ago, or internet till the late 50s. Nobody thought there can be something called an internet, which can at a press of a button give you information on anything that you ask for, or be able to run 6 different factories from one city, sitting in one city through the internet, or be able to send mail instantly at the speed of light. So all these are things which come out of the innovation, and that requires a certain mindset which needs to be developed. We have in the Vedic system always placed great emphasis on the mindset. Numbers don't matter if your mindset is not according to those numbers. You can have 1,000 goats standing at one place, and a single tiger can come before them, and all the 1,000 goats, even though they are in larger numbers, they will all run, because that is their mindset. You can have strength, but if you don't have the mindset, you will not be able to act according to that strength. In a circus, you can have 5 strong, well-fed lions. One thin, wiry ringmaster walks into the cage and orders these lions to climb up the bench. They will all obey and climb up. He will say, open your mouth. They will all open their mouth. He'll put his head in each one of them. The audience will clap. Question is, why these lions don't bite his head off? Because of the mindset that has been prepared. So in the final analysis, the Vedic approach to economic policy making is to develop a mindset where you produce, but you harmonize it with spiritual values, and do not become attached to property, incomes, so on. Nor is your society going to place a high value on acquisition of material wealth. Material wealth, as I say, will produce the one-dimensional approach to material wealth will produce greed. Greed will produce corruption. And a corrupt society is one which is totally one-dimensional in the pursuit of wealth. By any method, make the money. I've seen very able people rising to very high positions and then getting caught and going to jail for most petty crimes that they could think of, considering the positions they have achieved. And it's because of this one-dimensional focus. So this balance between spiritual advancement and economic material prosperity is the fundamental of the Vedic principles that should guide economic policy making. And and in the process, the priorities that we have for our society, and the strategy we adopt by which we don't leave the world in a worse position than we found it. This, in substance, is what I want to say. Thank you very much.